Hi, everybody. I'm doing something a little bit different this time. I'm using the Zoom meetings to record the video because I was having some trouble with the audio the other way I was doing it. So basically, we're going to take a look today at Isis and Osiris. I think there's going to be a couple of videos probably. And yeah, so let's look at what you guys read. And there's a lot to talk about and a lot to think about. And we'll have a lot to discuss and discussion questions as well. So without further ado, let me switch over to this PowerPoint here using the screen share feature. I believe you guys should all be able to see that. Okay, so we are talking about ancient Egypt, and ancient Egyptian mythology is super fun. There's a lot to dig into, and I wish we were able to dig into it in even more detail. But at least we'll hit up some of the coolest stories this time, and we'll talk about Isis and Osiris and how they fit into sort of the larger themes we've been talking about for this course. So ancient Egypt, civilization formed around the river of the Nile. Rivers are, of course, very important for civilization. And there's some major cities in Egypt that were always especially important, such as Thebes, where the gods were worshipped. Cairo kind of comes along later, but originally is the city of Giza there, where the pyramids are. And later on, we have Alexandria, which is kind of a melting point between Greeks and Egyptians. And let's put a pin in that because that interaction is going to come up in the future. But the book goes into a few different sites, but for our purposes, Thebes is a big one. Another one is Heliopolis, the city of the sun, which has a very strong religious tradition around 9 Egyptian gods. But it was obviously a tradition that had a lot of flexibility, just like the Greeks, and there's a lot of different stories. What our textbook has done is put together a bunch of different stories to try and get some sense of the whole big picture of the gods and how people felt about them. There's different time periods in Egypt, and actually a lot of the most famous stuff from ancient Egypt comes from the later time period of Egypt, which is known appropriately enough as the New Kingdom, which is a few thousand years, after the Old Kingdom, which is around the 3000s BC, which is when the pyramids were built. So Egypt spans quite a long time and changed a lot. And I'll try and talk about ways things changed as we go on. But through it, we can kind of see some core principles and some core ideas of the myth, the many myths of ancient Egypt. So without further ado, let's kind of get into our cast of characters here. Who are we talking about when we talk about the Egyptian gods? Who's important? And what do they kind of represent for the Egyptians? Well, Egypt is based around this river in a desert. You've got crops you can grow, you've got fertility, you've got food, you've got happiness and life within a very, very narrow window. And Egypt doesn't tend to move too far outside the window because when you do, you get into the desert. So what kind of gods are going to be important in that context? Well, in the desert, the sun god is going to be super important. And there are actually multiple different sun gods in ancient Egypt, and they kind of blur together in various ways, have different names. Sometimes they're thought of as the same god, sometimes they're thought of as different. Sometimes there's a god of the sun who's high in the sky, or there's the god of the sun who's, near setting, different things like that. But some of the names you might hear are Amun, Ra, and sometimes Aten. And they are usually represented with a disc in some way, some kind of sphere representing the sun in their art. And sometimes the falcon is associated with Ra. Now, the pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is said to be a descendant of Ra, so is closely connected to Ra, and in some traditions joins Ra in the heavens after he dies. But as we're going to see, it's a bit more complicated with that, because there are actually a lot of gods who are associated with the pharaoh. But if you think about being in a desert, the sun's going to be a very important god. And in the version that we read, Amun is the first god and kind of the creator of all the other gods, the first to emerge from that mound of mud that we saw when we were briefly looking at the Egyptian creation myth. So if we were to reconstruct the creation myth, Amun is the next generation after the mud and the water. But pretty soon, we've talked about Nut and Geb, who are going to come up a little bit in the reading, the god of the earth and the goddess of the sky, kind of parallels to Greek mythology there, only the roles are reversed. And they're the next generation after. And pretty soon we get to the third generation, which has a lot of the gods that we know. And I want to talk about Osiris. So Osiris, very weird and interesting god in a lot of ways. Osiris is strongly associated with the earth and with crops and with fertility. But he is specifically really strongly associated with the good soil that is around the Nile River, the kind of soil that you can grow things in. That's a big part of what he's associated with. But he's got a lot going on too. He's associated with the pharaohs. Here we see him on a throne dressed up with the ceremonial garb of the pharaohs and the ceremonial false beard that pharaohs often were. So that's showing his association to the pharaohs. But he was also associated with the dead and with the afterlife. It's kind of a weird combination of things compared to the Greek stuff, because the god of the afterlife, instead of being this scary, distant god, is a god that a lot of people worship and like, and is supposed to be good and a positive force, and associated with the kings and the pharaohs, who are supposed to be good. So Cyrus, he sometimes seemed to be dead, and we'll get into this myth, which says why he's dead. And he is the ruler over the afterlife, but he also has a presence in life, being associated with the pharaohs and being sort of a pharaoh of the dead, kind of. Yeah, and so he's supposed to be a good type of guy, but he is very much associated with this sort of new growth of new crops when the Nile floods, because the Nile floods on a very regular basis, and then the crops come back. And so the soil is rejuvenated and Osiris is kind of back in action in a certain sense. So there's that, his kind of fertility is kind of more temporary than anything else. Then we've got Isis. And oh my gosh, Isis is a big deal. We're going to see that she crops up in other religions outside of Egypt. She becomes important even outside of Egypt. But already in Egypt, she is pretty darn important. So she seems to be associated with the timing of the flood. In some myths, she's the one who calls the flood into being and says, hey, here comes the flood. And that is sort of bringing the world back to life in a way. And we're going to see her bring someone else back to life, namely Osiris. And there's a certain star in the sky, which we know as the star Sirius, but the Egyptians sometimes called Sothis. And this is the brightest star in the sky. And you start seeing it in the sky right around the time period when the Nile would flood. So it was associated with Isis. That's one thing about the Egyptian gods, is that they tend to be kind and reliable because the Nile is so regular and reliable. If the gods are associated with nature, you can rely on that river to flood at the same times every year and to water your crops in the same way at the same times and kind of take care of you, because you got to have food, you got to have enough to eat. And so that fertility is nourished by this sort of regularity that Isis is all about. And Isis is also strongly associated with motherhood. She's often shown on a throne as kind of the queen, the pharaoh's partner, and with a little baby who is baby Horus, who is another god who is associated with kingship. Now, I should mention that there is one sort of villainous god here. Sometimes he comes off as more of a trickster than outright evil, but in other myths he comes off as very much a villain. And this is Set, also known as Seth, which is a fun name, the evil god Seth. A lot of the Egyptian gods are associated with animals. Weirdly, we don't quite understand what animal they're trying to depict with Seth. But it might be a kind of jackal or a wild dog, but it has a long, almost anteater-like face and is always sort of depicted in the same way. So at least we can recognize it in the art. And what Seth appears to be associated with is the desert, the bad soil that can't grow anything. And so he is locked in an eternal struggle with his brother, who's associated with the good soil, his brother Osiris. So that generation of gods has a lot of strife, as we're going to get into when we get into the myth more specifically. Okay. Then we also have Horus, who is the son of Isis and Osiris. his animal is the falcon, and in a lot of versions of the myth, Horus avenges his father against Seth. So he goes and defeats Seth as a kind of warrior hero, and assures that his father is avenged. And the falcon and Horus are very much associated with the current pharaoh. So if Osiris is kind of the pharaoh in the afterlife, Horus is kind of the pharaoh in life, and the next generation of pharaohs and child pharaohs and future pharaohs and stuff like that. So it's interesting how there's not just one god of pharaohing, and also Ra is associated with the pharaoh. So it gets complicated, and there's a lot of different interpretations and a lot of different myths. But Horus is quite important, and you often see statues of the pharaoh with a falcon. I should mention actually that we're familiar with these images of, you know, the head of an animal and the body of a human for these gods, but it seems like the Egyptians didn't actually think of their gods as animal-headed people. They thought of them as beings that could be both human and animal. And in their art, they tried to show them both at the same time. So they put the animal head on the person. But they more tended to imagine that the gods would be changing form constantly. It's kind of like the way that they show like the body in a way that doesn't really make sense. Like they've got the torso out, but the legs to the side. They're showing all aspects of the person at once. And so they're showing all aspects of the god at once too. Moving on to some other gods who don't come up as much in the story, but are still pretty important. We have Tot, who is a god of knowledge and is said to be the one who invented hieroglyphics, the Egyptian writing system. So he's pretty cool. And he's associated with the ibis, which is a sort of water-dwelling bird common in the Nile River. Oh, and here he is too, making a cameo in this other one. And then Anubis is kind of a god of the dead, but really, you know, the pharaoh's the god of the afterlife. Anubis might be more thought of as the god of the moment of death, the god of, leading you to the afterlife. There are a lot of gods that are kind of like this, and they're called psychopomps. Psychopomp meaning guide for the soul in Greek. Hermes is kind of another one. He can move to the afterlife, and he brings Persephone out of the afterlife. That's a similar role that a lot of mythological figures play. And Anubis is also the judge of the dead. He will judge them in Osiris's court and decide whether they get to live with Osiris or whether the dead should be destroyed. So what he'll do is he'll weigh the heart of the dead person, and he will weigh it against the feather of truth. And if your heart has been weighed down by evil actions, then your heart will sink, and the feather will rise, and you will be declared evil and get eaten by this monster over here. And your soul will basically be destroyed. But if you're good, and your heart is not weighed down too terribly much, it will be lighter than the feather, and you'll get to live with Osiris, happily after life ever after. And so Anubis is a very important god, and his animal is specifically the jackal. Sometimes associated with dogs as well. There's kind of an overlap there. But yeah, these are kind of symbolic animals for the gods rather than heads per se. Although it is interesting to see all these animal heads all over the place. Okay, so those are the big gods there. And I think, yeah, let's end this video here and pick up by telling the story of the myth in the next video.